Back in my early days of ministry, actually, in fact, the very first ministry that I served in Ohio, I began serving, of course, fresh out of college. I was excited about everything that was going on, and the church that I was in, they hired me, and then the pastor retired, and another guy took over, and the church was just, it was growing. I mean, it was just, we were growing really well. Things were going good. The church was growing. My youth ministry where I was serving was growing. Things were going really good. And so we began to talk about, man, we're just kind of maxing out our building. We kind of probably should think about doing 2 services in the mornings to accommodate the crowds. And then we had an architect that was coming in, and they had drawn up some plans for us to build a big addition onto the building that we were in to expand to accommodate the size of our growth and what we were expecting to be happening. And things were just going really, really, really well. And then just out of nowhere, I mean, for real, just out of nowhere, the pastor that I was serving under resigned. And the Lord had just called him and moved him to another church. But man, we were just shocked. I was devastated. I mean, I thought this was like a long haul, like we were going to be a team forever. And this church is going to boom and all of this. And so I was devastated. We eventually, we called a new pastor to lead us in things, but things just weren't the same, if you will. Just weren't quite the same. A couple years later, we had gone from, this point where we were growing and we were talking about expansions and new buildings and things like that. We went from that to at a point where now we were at a point where layoffs were happening. Our ministry had just shrunk to that size. And I still remember the day my pastor sat me down and he said to me that the church decided that we needed to downsize and I was going to become part-time at the church. I'd no longer be full-time. I was going to have to go find another job. And man, I was devastated. First ministry I served in, I was young, I was excited about all that was happening. And I remember thinking to myself, this isn't what I signed up for. This isn't what I expected when I got into the ministry. That just wasn't something that I had planned to do. But here I was, it's like this is where I'm at. This is what life has dealt with me. And so I ended up getting a second job just to be able to provide for my family there. Sometimes life just doesn't quite go as you expect it to go. Sometimes life just kind of throws you curveballs, if you will, or mixes things up. And in those moments when life is different and life throws you those curveballs and things, a lot of times it can feel like God is distant. It can feel like God has kind of abandoned you, if you will. It, when dreams fade, when people die, when careers fail, all of those things and different things happening in your life, it can sometimes feel like God just kind of slammed the door of life in your face and left. And kind of left you just kind of holding the bag, if you will, and you're kind of like, what in the world is going on, Today we're going to start a new series. And over the next several weeks, we're going to dive into this Old Testament book of Ruth. The Old Testament book of Ruth. It's a story about 2 widows who really experienced the unexpected. Life had thrown them some curveballs that they definitely didn't expect. And we're going to see through the book of Ruth over the next several weeks, we're going to see these ladies, their dedication through their despair. We're going to see how they remain dedicated in the desperate times of their life. And we're going to see how that dedication in their despair, it took them from ruin to redemption. How God brought redemption into their life. We could probably argue that nobody knows the feeling of abandonment and the devastation more than Ruth and Naomi, the 2 main characters of this book. Their story, it really begins with the worst. We're going to dive into this a little bit today, but it starts pretty rough. It starts with death, famine, poverty, and to top it off, it seems like God is just really silent in their life, like he just left. Like he just abandoned them there. The book of Ruth, it doesn't end with despair, though. That's the good thing. That's what I want to give you today, just so you understand over the next several weeks. It doesn't end this way. It doesn't end with despair. The story overflows with hope. because God is working behind the scenes. God is working on behalf of these two widows in ways that they least expected. And what we can learn from this is that we can never associate God's silence with his absence. Just because maybe God is seemingly silent in your situation, in your life, in the moment, it doesn't mean that God is absent. It doesn't mean that God has left you or abandoned you at all. On the surface, this book, it tells the story of two widows in a very kind landowner. His name's Boaz. But even more, I'm hoping that the book of Ruth is going to teach us about God's faithfulness, his love, and his providence. The book of Ruth, it takes place in a very dark time in Israel's history. This book was written, and we're kind of confused on who wrote the book of Ruth. It wasn't Ruth who wrote it. She's just kind of the hero of the story, the main character of the story of this book. But we're not really sure who wrote this book, but we understand that this book was probably written during the period of the Judges. That's the book that comes before the book of Ruth. And it's the period of the Judges for the nation of Israel. It was this time when Israel was kind of on this roller coaster ride with God. They would be on these highs with God, but then they would kind of go off the deep end. They would get away from God. They begin to do things their own way and do what they want to do. And then God would bring a judge. He would bring somebody in to bring them back to him. And so they would come back to God, and then they had those high moments again. And so this book, this story, it takes place in that timeline. The Life Application Bible says that this was a time for Israel where they were pleasing themselves, not God. And that was the definition of where they were here in this. It was a dark time for them. It was a time of disobedience. It was a time of idolatry. It was a time of violence. Sounds a lot like our world today. But this was also a time after a great famine in the land of Judah. And this is what causes Naomi's family to leave and find a home, if you will, in another country. They were very frustrated with their situation. Naomi and them were frustrated. The book of Ruth, it takes place in this town called Bethlehem. You ever heard of that? It takes place in this little town called Bethlehem. Bethlehem, it was surrounded by grain fields, by barley fields, and that's what really gave it its name, Bethlehem. The name Bethlehem, it means house of bread. And so this is where the story takes place here. But the problem is that the city of bread, this town of Bethlehem, they actually had no bread. They were in a famine there, and we're not real sure what caused the famine in this situation there, or whether maybe they had been attacked by another city and they pummeled all of their fields, the barley fields. We're not really sure, but they're in this very severe famine. So this story here in the book of Ruth, it begins with the history and the journey of this family, Elimelech and his wife Naomi. Elimelech and Naomi, and they got two sons. And so because of the famine that's in Bethlehem, because of the very frustrating situation that they are finding themselves in Bethlehem, they decide that they're going to move to this town called Moab to try to find some food. Now, we know that it had to have been a very frustrating time for them and in a very frustrating situation for Elimelech and Naomi and them to move. Because Moab was not something that an Israelite would just be like, hey, let's just go visit Moab. Hey, let's just go, move over to Moab. That looks like a nice little town. They wouldn't have done that. You see, there was bad blood between the Israelites and the Moabites. There was bad blood. There was tension in there. Moab was one of the nations that oppressed Israel during this period of the Judges, this time of a season of the Judges for them. They were one of the towns that oppressed them. So even if Israel had already defeated Moab and conquered their land or whatever, there still would have been a lot of tension, a lot of bad blood between these two towns, and it would have been a situation where they're like, hey, let's just not go there anywhere but there. It's kind of like me being a Buckeye. I don't ever want to go to Michigan. All right? It's the rivalry, and I don't want to go up north. I'm good, in there. And so it's kind of that situation in this situation. In fact, the Moabites were not even allowed to worship at the tabernacle. Because the Moabites, when the Israelites were exiting out of Egypt, the Moabites refused to let the Israelites pass through their town. And so because of that, they've been kind of banned from worshiping in the tabernacle. That's the kind of bad blood that there was between these two nations. So the fact that Elimelech and Naomi would say, hey, let's leave Bethlehem and go to Moab, they were very frustrated. It was a very frustrating time for them. They were desperate, if you will, to try to figure this out. So anyway, so they moved to Moab. Years later, Elimelech dies in Moab. We're not sure why. The story doesn't tell us what happens and why he dies. The Bible, it just says that he died. And then after that, Naomi's two sons, Naomi's now a widow, she's got two sons. They end up marrying Moabite women. And so her sons, Mahlon is his name, and Kilian is the other's name. They marry Moabite women. Now, again, this is something that by tradition, the Jewish faith just did not encourage them to do this, to marry. They didn't encourage them to marry outside of their race, and especially with these Moabites. There's several reasons for that, but mainly it was because of the Moabites' commitment to other gods. They were a pagan nation that worshiped false gods, and so God wanted the Israelites to stay away from that. But it was also that whole issue with them not helping Israel in the Exodus. So this was very, very, very frowned upon in this situation. So I would imagine that Naomi was probably not too happy with her sons when they came and said, hey, Mom, I think we're going to marry this girl. And she's like, she's a Moabite. What would your dad have said? You know, like, man, he's probably rolling over in his tomb right now. You know, like this is just, and she's probably not happy with the situation. But at this point, you know, she's a widow. She's like, hey, I just want you guys to be happy at this point, right? I don't know. That's just what I'm assuming in this situation. So they marry these Moabite women. But then after some time, the Bible tells us that the sons die. Again, we're not told why. We're not told how. We're not told if they die together or if it's a period of time between. I don't know. But all we know is that Elimelech dies, and then the two sons die as well. So can you imagine the frustration of Naomi in this season of life? Can you imagine what they're going through? Out of frustration with the famine, they leave Bethlehem for the hope of a better life somewhere else. But life has left Naomi in worse shape than when she left Bethlehem. She's now lost her husband. She's lost her two sons. She's in poverty. She's got nothing left, no way to take care of herself. And she's just stuck in life, if you will. Can I share something with you? This is quite a parallel of many of our lives. Oftentimes, we face unexpected things in life. Oftentimes, we walk through things that we just didn't realize was going to happen, or we didn't expect to happen, and things just don't go the way that we think that we should. And so what ends up happening is a lot of times we end up, watch this, we will leave the place where God lives. We'll try to go find our own source of provision. We'll leave the house of bread to try to figure it out ourselves. What I mean by this is that we often think that our way is better than God's way. And oftentimes we're walking through a situation in life, we're walking through something unexpected, and we're like, this is not what I expected to happen. God must have forgot about me. God must have abandoned me, so I got to figure this out on my own. And we leave, and we try to do that. You see, Elimelech left God's land and God's people for the land and the people of the enemy, thinking that it was going to be better for them. Instead of trusting God in their current situation, they left. Let me also point out some words here so that we can see their meanings in this story. In verse number 1 there of Ruth chapter number 1, it says that they went to sojourn in the country. They went to sojourn in the country. The word sojourn there just simply implies a temporary visit. It was just simply this, hey, let's just sojourn over here. Let's just visit over here. Let's get ourselves back on our feet. Let's get some provisions. Let's get some things. And then we'll come back to Bethlehem and things will be good. That's the idea, verse number 1. Verse number 2, it says that they remained there. That phrase implies a long-term visit. That's the idea of, okay, this was just supposed to be a short little thing just to help us get back on our feet, but it's taking a little bit longer, than we expected, but man, we're still going to go back. We're still eventually moving back to Bethlehem. It's just taking us a little bit longer to get our things in order. That's kind of the idea there. But then you see in verse number 4, it says that they lived there. This means that they settled in for good. This is that idea of, hey, I'm just going to step out over here for a minute, just kind of get myself together, collect my things, then I'm going to come back and things will be good. Then it's taking us a little bit longer. We're still thinking we're going to go back, but just taking us a little bit longer. So now it's like, we're here. We kind of got life here. The kids got some friends and, it costs so much money to move back. Why don't we just stay? And oftentimes that's what we do in life. Oftentimes that's what we do with God. I just need a little time to myself. I just need a little bit of a break here for a moment. I just kind of need to catch myself. I just kind of need to get some things together in my life before I return back to God, before I return back to serving Him, before I return back to church and those types of things. I'm just going to soldier it a little bit for a little ways, but I'm going to come back. And then the next thing you know, it's just a little bit longer. We're like, I'm still thinking I'm going to go back. And then the next thing you know, we're in a complete season, different way of life, and God is an afterthought for us. This is often what happens to us. When I saw this progression in these verses here, my mind immediately went to the old phrase, maybe you've heard this before. It says that sin will take you farther than you wanted to go. It'll cost you more than you're willing to pay and keep you longer than you wanted to stay. That's what sin will do. It'll pull you away and it'll suck you in. It's going to cost you more than you wanted to do, and it's going to keep you longer than you want to stay. And for Naomi, it took her farther away from God's presence. It cost her the lives of the closest people in her life, and it left her completely frustrated with her life circumstances. That's what happened to her. But here's the beautiful thing about God. The beautiful thing about God is that even when we leave the presence of God, even when we leave the house of bread, if you will, even if we leave those moments, God doesn't leave us. He doesn't leave us. Why? Because of the faithfulness. Because of the faithfulness. In verse number 6 there of Ruth chapter number 1, we read that Naomi, she made the decision to return back to Bethlehem. She decides to move back home. She heard that the famine was over in Bethlehem and that people had food and things there. And I want you to see what she says here in Ruth chapter 1 and verse number 6. It says, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. That word, that phrase there, that the Lord had visited his people. That word visited there in the Hebrew, it's the word pakad. Pakad is the word. It literally means that the Lord came to the aid of, or that the Lord has concern for. That's what it literally means in this situation. It's a phrase, we see it often in the New Testament, that the Lord visited his people. That means that he came to the aid of them. He had concern for them in that. And so it describes God's action of his provision for his people. And so that's what she's recognizing here. Listen, God is faithful to intervene in the lives of his people and to provide. Don't ever forget that. No matter how frustrating your life might be, no matter how frustrating of a season you might be in, please understand that God will visit you. God will step in. He will intervene. He will come to the aid of you. Rest in that. Rest in the faithfulness of God. Now look at verses 8 and 9 here, Ruth chapter 1. Look at what takes place here. This conversation takes place. It says that Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law. Remember that now Naomi, her sons had married some Moabite women, but then they died, right? So now these two girls are now left without husbands in there, right? And so there's these three ladies, Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws. So Naomi says to her two daughter-in-laws, she says, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them and lifted up their voices and wept. So what takes place here is that Naomi is like, listen, I'm going back to Bethlehem. It's not really a good situation for you guys to be there. You guys just go back to your homes. Go back to your homes in Moab. Just try to start a new life there. You've got a better chance for yourselves in Moab than you're going to have with me in Bethlehem. And so that's what she's telling. And she's praying for her daughters-in-law that God would show them kindness, like they had shown kindness to her sons and then to her after they left. That's what she's praying, is that God would show kindness to them. She's praying that they would find rest in maybe the home of another husband in Moabite. That's what she's thinking. So Naomi's praying that God would extend his loving kindness to Ruth and Orpah. That's what she's praying. The Hebrew word that's used here in this loving kindness, if you will, it's the word hesed. It's the Hebrew word hesed. It's actually a stronger word than just kindness. It actually means loyalty. It means love. It means devotion. So it's a very strong word. It's a very powerful word that's being used here. The Hebrew word hesed, it's the kind of love that's going to endure pain. It's the kind of love that's going to take personal sacrifice. It's the kind of kind of word, the loyalty, the love that's going to endure loss. It's a kind of love that will put anything on the line in order to remain loyal to another person. That's the type of love that she's praying for them to have, to find, that God's loving kindness would be on them, that God's hesed would be upon them. You see, Naomi recognizes the loyalty that Ruth and Orpah have shown to her, and she now desires, watch this, she now desires God's loyal love to be shown to them. That's what she's praying. That's what she's asking. Naomi's thinking was that the only hope for these two girls is for them to go back to their homeland. She didn't think that it would be a good idea for them to follow her back to Bethlehem and there begin. Because remember what I mentioned earlier, the Moabites, the Israelites, they just didn't get along very well. The Israelites looked down to them, and so she's just thinking if they came to Bethlehem with Naomi, that they'd be labeled outcasts in their community. They'd probably be shunned by their community. There'd be no chance that any guy would want to marry them or have anything to do with them. And so she's just thinking it's going to be much better for them to go that way than to go with her. But I want you to look at what Ruth said in verses 16 and 17. It says, but Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. You see, Ruth, she's ready to go all in with Naomi. She's ready to go all in with Naomi. In fact, she had probably already been this way. That's why she was talking about that hesed, that loyal love. That's why she was talking about that. She'd probably already been this way, but now she's expressing this loyal love to her. But choosing to stay with Naomi, catch what's happening here. By choosing to stay with Naomi, Ruth now, she's pretty much giving up any chance of a life for her own at this point. She's giving up her chance of finding another husband. She's giving up her chance of ever going back to her homeland. She's denouncing her pagan God and accepting the true God. She's leaving her family. She's leaving her security. And seemingly she's giving up her future to stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. What a beautiful thing this is. Imagine with me, imagine if we were that faithful to God. Imagine your life if you were all in with God. That you said, God, I'm with you. Thick or thin, I'm with you. I'm in it with you. I'm serving you. I'm staying loyal to you. I'm going to live for you. I will give up everything for you. Imagine that. Imagine going all in with God. You see, we can be faithful to God because God's been faithful to us. God has shown us his loyal love. And I get it. Maybe some of you don't agree with that statement, right? Maybe some of you are sitting in a situation in life. Maybe somebody's watching online and they're like, that doesn't make sense. That God has not been faithful to me. God has abandoned me. And you talk about a season of life, but my life, it's just been one kick in the teeth after another. And it just seems like I can't ever catch a break. In your current situation, you're stuck in a famine. You're so frustrated with life because you feel like that you're losing everything and you can't catch a break. And maybe you've already lost everything even in that situation. But here's the thing. We're going to see as we walk through the book of Ruth, we're going to see that God was working behind the scenes. Through all of this frustrating process, through all of this that's happening, God was working behind the scenes to bring about his purpose in the life of these widows. God was working. And so wherever you're at in your season of life right now, please understand that God is at work. God is at work in your life. The change in the famine that brought Naomi to realize, hey, I should probably go back home, back to Bethlehem. You understand, that was God working. That was God doing what he needed to do to get Naomi back into his presence, into the house of bread. He was working through all of this. God was not just passively watching Naomi suffer, but he was actively working to restore her. That's what he wants to do in your life. As we walk through this book, we're going to see proof of that verse there in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. That verse says that we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. We're going to see the proof of that here in the book of Ruth over the next several weeks. That God is working things out. For those who are called according to purpose, God's going to work it all out for his good, for your good. And even as that's always saying, even if we don't see it, God is working. Even when we don't feel it, God is working. And in Naomi's situation, she definitely couldn't see it. She definitely couldn't feel it. She felt like she had been abandoned by God in this situation. But Ruth's faithfulness to her was just one little act of God showing his faithfulness to Naomi. He's faithful to you. You just got to trust him. But oftentimes, in the thick of our struggles, we don't always see those little acts of faithfulness. We don't always see it. And that's what leads oftentimes to the fallout. That's what leads to the fallout. Look what happens when they ride back into Bethlehem. Okay, so now Naomi's back in Bethlehem. Orpah went back to Moab. Okay, she went back. Ruth decided to stay with her. So Naomi and Ruth now get back into Bethlehem. And I want you to see what happens here in verse number 19. It says, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, and the women said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. So they get back into town. It's been several years. I think the Bible says about 10 years since anybody has seen or heard from Naomi and her family. It's been about 10 years now. So this causes some commotion when they come back into this little town of Bethlehem. And so the Bible says that it stirred the community up, right, in there. So people start asking, is that Naomi? Naomi back? Hey, did you hear that? Naomi's back in town. And you can imagine how word begins to spread, right? I mean, we know how gossip works, right? I mean, we know. And look, none of what I'm about to say is in Scripture, but let's just assume that these people were a lot like we are today, right? Let's just assume for a minute. This is not Scripture, but let's assume, right? Naomi and Ruth roll into town. Don't forget, Ruth's the Moabite woman. So they come into town. So groups start to gather, right? It says women. Sorry, ladies. They start to gather. And they start whispering, is that Naomi? I mean, I heard they left town because they thought they were better than us. But now look, she looks rough. She ain't got no money. Where's her husband at? Where's her two boys? What happened to them? Girl. I bet she committed some kind of sin. I bet that's what happened. Her family left her because they were ashamed of her. Right? You know how gossip works, right? This is not a scripture, but come on. And then they're like, where did she get that cloak? It looked like she hadn't washed that thing in a year. What's wrong with her? She didn't even look. Has she been eating? Man, she looks sick. She looks terrible. She's way too thin. What is that? She's probably starving herself because she thinks she's better than us. And who's that with her? Is that a foreigner? She's hanging out with a Moabite? Girl. Don't she know that God told us to stay away from them? Right? Can you imagine the stir that caused in this town? Can you imagine the situation that's going on here? And again, it's not in Scripture, okay? But it says that she stirred up the town after being gone for 10 years. So I can only imagine the type of situation that's going here, right? And the stir that's happening. So Naomi, she wants to set the record straight. She wants to say, like, let's just put the gossip to rest. Let me tell you what's going on here. And so she puts the record, she said, look, I don't even want you to call me Naomi no more. I'm changing my name. Just call me Mara. And you're thinking, okay, what's that? How's that set the record straight, right? Let's do a brief word study real quick, okay? The name Naomi, it means pleasant, delightful, lovely. That's what she was known as, right? She was Naomi, the pleasant one, the delightful one, the lovely one. Naomi had left with a husband and 2 sons during a time of famine in Israel. They had left with the high hopes of a better life in a neighboring country. And now she's leaving very bitterly disappointed. She's returning, I'm sorry. Her husband and her 2 sons had died. She's in poverty. She's got nothing except a daughter-in-law, Ruth, who loved her deeply, but and wouldn't leave her. But that is literally all that she has. So she's having a fallout with God. She's having a fallout with God over her circumstances, over her situation. She hasn't walked away from her faith, because when you look at Scripture, she still called God the Lord. She still called him the Almighty, but she just doesn't understand what's happening in life. Have you been there? And she's having this fallout. She's like, listen, he's the Lord, right? He's the Almighty, but I don't understand what he's doing with me. I left as a pleasant, lovely, delightful woman, but that's just not me anymore. So she says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. The word Mara means bitter. She's no longer the pleasant, delightful, lovely one. She's now just the bitter one. Because of her situation, because she doesn't understand why God has allowed all these things to happen to her, she no longer is that pleasant, delightful woman anymore. She's bitter and she's distressed over life. I'd imagine that there may be some in this room today, or maybe somebody who's listening online who can relate to that. You had some high hopes for a bright future. You just ready to take on the world. You thought everything was going to go great, but all of a sudden life threw you the unexpected, and maybe it was one thing after another, and next thing you know, you're now just having this fallout. You still got your faith in God, and you're like, yeah, God's out there, and I'm trusting him, for salvation, but I'm just not sure that he really cares about me in this life. I'm not sure that he really cares about what's happening to me here, and why would he be allowing all of this stuff to happen to me if he does care about me? Maybe that resonates with you. And I don't understand why God allows certain things to happen in our lives. In your life, I wish I had answers for you today. I really do. I wish I had answers for my own life at times. But we just don't have those answers. God doesn't always give us that clear picture. But here's what God encouraged me with while I was studying through for this series and this message. This is what God encouraged me with. And if you don't catch anything else today, please catch this thought right here. When we deal with hardships in life, they might change us, but they will never change God. Naomi's circumstances changed her. She admittedly says, I'm no longer that pleasant, delightful person. I'm just a bitter woman at this point. It changed who she was, but listen, it never changed who God was. He's still the Lord Almighty. He's still the Lord Almighty, and he will always be the Lord Almighty. Revelation chapter 1, verse 8 says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. Listen to me today. You might be in a fallout with God today. You might be so bitter over your circumstances and over your life and what is happening to you. But listen, God is still on the throne. God is still the Almighty. He is and he was and he will be the Almighty. So what do we do? What do we do when life gives us the unexpected? How do we handle these situations? Very simply, can I just put it this way? We just stay faithful to God. You say, God, I don't understand it, but I'm trusting you with it. God, it doesn't make sense to me, and I'm going to be honest, I'm a little bitter about the situation, but I'm going to trust you. I'm going to return to your presence. I'm going to come back to the house of bread, if you will. I'm going to return to your presence, and I'm just going to trust you. Today, we've seen the frustration, the faithfulness, and the fallout in Ruth chapter 1. Can I say today this? In the middle of every frustration and fallout that we have in our lives, God is faithful. Right smack in the middle of it. God is faithful. He's working. Sometimes it's not always the way that we want it to be working, but God is working. Sometimes we have to look really hard to see that God is working. But I can tell you, because I know that He is faithful, that God is there. He is faithful to visit you. He's going to be faithful to come to your aid. He is faithful to have concern for you and your life and your situation. He's faithful. I told you earlier about that time in my life where I was moved to that part-time position in my church, and I was pretty devastated, not understanding really what was going on, and thinking this wasn't what I signed up for, and just wasn't sure what to do. I eventually found a job working in a factory where we were making car stereos and things. And before my first day at that job, in my devotions, and this was just a little way that God was being faithful to me, but in my devotions before my first day at that job, the devotion talked about in whatever we do, we should do everything for the glory of God. Understand, I'm sitting in a situation where I'm about to walk into a job that I don't want to do. I had a college degree to be a pastor, and I'm like, that's what I should be doing full time. That's my job. That's what I thought. And so God begins to speak to me in this moment. In a very little way, He's being faithful to me in this moment. He's saying, whatever you do, I want you to do it for my honor and for my glory. So I made this determination. Okay, God, this is you. If you want me to have this job that I don't think I should be having, but if you want me to have this job, God, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it for your honor, for your glory. And so I went into that job determined that I was going to be the best car stereo maker that the world has ever seen. And I put my best foot forward every single day when I walked in there. If there was downtime in the job, I found something to do to keep myself busy, whether it was picking up a broom and sweeping up dust or whatever it might be. I found myself to be busy. I worked fast, I worked efficient, I worked happy, and it didn't take long for supervisors to begin to notice. And they began to see the hard work that I was putting in. And they began to move me to like a better line. And so I went from, this factory that had no climate control. When it was summertime, it was hot. When it was wintertime, it was cold in there. It was dusty. It was dirty. They moved me to a climate controlled area where we were building stereos for luxury cars. And so I was in a climate controlled, dust free area, part of that job, because they saw that I was working hard. The big bosses up front in the office area, they began to notice. I'd be walking down the hall and they would be like, hey, you're Steve Kirkwood, correct? I said, yeah. And they said, man, we're hearing great things from you. We so appreciate the hard work that you're putting in. These are the big wigs of the office there, and they're starting to know who I am, just making car stereos and all of this. And every time that somebody complimented me on the job that I did, every time that somebody said, hey, we appreciate you working hard, my response to them every single time was well, listen, I work for you, but I want you to know ultimately I work for the Lord. And the Bible tells me whatever I do, I should do for the honor and glory for God. And I'm just trying to make Him happy. And that was my testimony. And here's the incredible thing about that whole situation, that whole season of my life there. I was actually able to do more ministry working in that factory, and I was able to share the gospel with more people working in that factory than I ever would have done if I sat in an office at a church all day long. See, God was at work. It was a frustrating time for me. It was a difficult, I didn't understand. It's not what I signed up for. God was at work. He was being faithful. And He was doing what He needed to do to get me where He wanted me to be. God was at work, even when I thought He had been. I've never forgotten that. And I hope that you won't either. He is and always will be the God of love. My God, I thank you for your faithfulness. God, I thank you that in these seasons of life where we don't understand what you're doing, and it's so frustrating for us, and we get so bitter and upset, think that you've abandoned us, that God, you're still working. Your silence doesn't mean your absence. And God, I thank you for being so faithful to bring us where you want us to be for the season that you want us to be. And so, God, my prayer today is that for each and every one of us that are here today, those that are listening online, God, that my prayer is that we would see you working, that we would look, even in these bitter, frustrating seasons of life, God, may we dig really deep to see where you're working and what you're doing and what can I learn about your faithfulness through this tough season of my life. And God, even if we can't understand any of it, even if we can't see anything that you're doing or we don't feel anything that you're doing, God, can we simply just rest in your faithfulness that you are the Lord Almighty? We just give up and say, God, hey, I don't see it, I don't feel it, but I'm trusting you because you're faithful. You've never left me. And your word says that you never will leave me because you're a God of loyal love. So God, my prayer is that you would encourage us with that today. Wherever we are, whoever we are, whatever situation we are, God, may we remember that you are constantly loyal in your love to us. And God, we give you all the honor, glory, and praise for that. In your name we pray.